September 12, 1945, 3 weeks after Japan's surrender. A military transport truck rattled along a dusty California road, carrying 37 Japanese women toward an uncertain fate. Inside the covered vehicle, Tomoko Hayashi sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her spine rigid despite the jolting movement. At 23 years old, she had served as a communications clerk for the Imperial Japanese Navy, intercepting and translating radio transmissions until American forces captured her unit in the Philippines during the final chaotic weeks of the war. Around her, the other women maintained similar postures of controlled fear. They had been told what to expect from American captivity. The propaganda had been clear and consistent throughout the war. Americans were devils who tortured prisoners, who starved their captives deliberately, who showed no mercy to Japanese people. The women had heard stories of unspeakable cruelties, of prison camps where Japanese soldiers were worked to death or simply shot for entertainment. Midori Kimura, 21 years old and sitting beside Tomoko, whispered in Japanese so quietly that only those nearest could hear, "Do you think they will separate us?" Her voice trembled slightly. She had been a nurse's aide, captured while tending to wounded soldiers in a field hospital. Tomoko had no answer. None of them knew what awaited them at this American prisoner of war facility. They only knew what years of wartime propaganda had taught them to believe about their enemies. The truck suddenly slowed and turned, and through gaps in the canvas covering, the women caught glimpses of their destination. Rows of simple wooden barracks stretched across a flat landscape. Guard towers stood at intervals along a chain-link fence. It looked exactly like the prison camps they had been warned about. When the truck finally stopped and the canvas was pulled back, late afternoon sunlight flooded in, causing several women to squint and shield their eyes. American soldiers stood waiting, their faces unreadable beneath their helmets. One of them, a young private with sun-weathered skin and light brown hair, stepped forward and gestured for them to climb down from the truck. Tomoko was among the first to descend, her legs stiff from hours of sitting. As her feet touched American soil for the first time, she felt a wave of fear wash over her. This was enemy territory. These were the people she had been taught to hate and fear in equal measure. But something was wrong with the picture. The soldiers weren't pointing weapons at them. Their expressions weren't cruel or mocking. They simply looked tired and perhaps a bit uncertain, as if they too were unsure how to handle this unusual situation of Japanese women prisoners. The young private spoke in English, his words incomprehensible to most of the women. But his tone was neither harsh nor threatening. It sounded almost apologetic. Tomoko glanced at Midori, whose face reflected the same confusion she felt. Whatever they had expected to find in American captivity, this wasn't it. The women were led into a large mess hall that smelled of unfamiliar spices and cooking meat. Long wooden tables stretched the length of the room, their surfaces worn smooth from years of use. The American soldiers directed them to sit, their gestures patient despite the language barrier. Tomoko chose a spot near the middle of one table, with Midori sitting close beside her for comfort. What happened next would challenge everything they believed about their captors. American kitchen staff emerged carrying large metal trays laden with food. As plates were set before each woman, a collective silence fell over the group. The portions were enormous. Each plate held a thick slice of pink ham, glistening with juice and fat. Beside it sat a generous serving of white navy beans cooked in a rich brown sauce with visible chunks of Moor pork. A piece of bread with real butter accompanied the meal, along with a cup of hot coffee. Tomoko stared at her plate in complete disbelief. This was more food than she had seen in a single meal in over 2 years. During the final months of the war in Japan, rations had dwindled to almost nothing. A small bowl of rice mixed with barley, perhaps some pickled vegetables if you were fortunate, maybe a tiny piece of fish shared among an entire family. She had watched her younger sister grow thin and weak from hunger before she left to serve the military. And now here, in enemy captivity, On what she had expected to be the worst day of her life, she sat before more food than her family could have afforded, even in peacetime. Ayako Matsuda, 25 years old and sitting across from Tomoko, spoke in a hushed voice. "This must be a trick. They want to poison us or make us sick." She had been an administrator in a military supply office, her careful nature evident in how she examined every detail of the meal before her. But the American soldiers were eating the same food at nearby tables. Tomoko watched as the young private who had helped them from the truck took a large bite of his ham, chewing contentedly while talking with another guard. If this was poison, the Americans were consuming it too. 19-year-old Noriko Fujita picked up her fork with trembling hands. She had been the youngest member of a clerical unit, barely finished with her training when she was captured. "I am so hungry," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "I cannot remember the last time I was not hungry." Tomoko made a decision. She cut a small piece of the ham and brought it to her mouth. The meat was tender and salty, flavored with something sweet she could not identify. The taste was overwhelming after months of bland, insufficient rations. She chewed slowly, waiting for some terrible effect, but none came. There was only the simple satisfaction of real food filling her empty stomach. Around her, other women began to eat. Some cried quietly as they took their first bites. Others ate mechanically, as if afraid the food might disappear if they acknowledged enjoying it. Private Daniel Cooper had grown up on a cattle ranch outside of Fort Worth, Texas. At 24 years old, he had spent more of his life around horses and livestock than around people. His assignment to guard duty at a prisoner of war camp had been unexpected, but his easygoing nature and natural kindness made him well suited for the work. What he had not expected was to be assigned to oversee Japanese women prisoners. The morning after their arrival, Daniel watched as the women emerged from their barracks for morning roll call. They moved in tight groups, their faces carefully blank, their postures defensive. He recognized fear when he saw it. He had seen the same look in the eyes of wild horses that had never been gentled, animals that expected cruelty because they had known nothing else. It bothered him more than he cared to admit. During breakfast that second morning, Daniel noticed that several of the women were eating slowly, almost reverently, as if they still could not believe the food was real. One woman in particular caught his attention. She had an intelligent face and observant eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her surroundings. She sat straight-backed and composed, but he could see the confusion in her expression as she looked at her plate of scrambled eggs, bacon, and toast. That was Tomoko, though Daniel did not yet know her name. He approached the table slowly, not wanting to startle anyone. In his hand, he carried a small bowl of strawberry preserves that had been set out for the guards, but which the Japanese women had not touched, perhaps not knowing what it was. He set it gently on the table near Tomoko and pointed to the toast, then to the preserves, making a spreading motion with his hand. Tomoko looked up at him with startled eyes. For a long moment, they simply regarded each other across the divide of language and nationality and war. Then, carefully, she nodded her understanding. Daniel smiled. It was not a large smile or a particularly remarkable one. It was simply the natural expression of a man who had been raised to show courtesy to others, enemy or not. But to Tomoko, who had been taught that Americans were savage and cruel, that simple smile was profoundly disorienting. She had expected hatred in American eyes. She had prepared herself for contempt and brutality. But this young soldier with sun-weathered skin and calloused hands looked at her with nothing more than mild friendliness, as if she were simply another person rather than a defeated enemy. Midori, sitting beside Tomoko, whispered urgently in Japanese, "Why is he being kind to us? What does he want?" It was a question that none of them could answer. The propaganda had prepared them for every possible horror of American captivity, except this one simple thing: basic human decency. Over the following days, Daniel's small kindnesses continued. He learned to say good morning in Japanese, his pronunciation terrible, but his effort genuine. When it rained, he brought extra blankets to the women's barracks without being asked. When Noriko struggled to understand instructions during work assignments, he used patient gestures and simple drawings to communicate rather than showing frustration. Tomoko found herself watching him, trying to reconcile this reality with everything she had been taught. The Americans were supposed to be demons, but this cowboy from Texas who smiled easily and moved with unhurried grace seemed nothing like a demon at all. Tomoko lay awake in her bunk that night, staring at the dark ceiling of the barracks. Her stomach was full for the first time in months, and the unfamiliar sensation kept her from sleep. In the quiet darkness, memories she had tried to suppress came flooding back. Tokyo, February 1945. She remembered standing in line for rations with her mother and younger sister, Yuki. The line had stretched for blocks, and they had waited for 3 hours in the cold only to receive a small bag of rice mixed with so much barley and millet that it barely resembled rice at all. A few dried sardines, some wilted vegetables. That had been their food for an entire week for a family of 4. Her father had already given up his portions, insisting he was not hungry so that his daughters could eat. Tomoko had watched him grow thinner each day, his cheekbones becoming more pronounced, his hands trembling slightly when he thought no one was looking. He told them stories of victory, of how their sacrifices would be worth it when Japan won the war. But his eyes had been hollow with a truth he could not speak aloud. Yuki had been 14 years old, at an age when she should have been growing tall and strong. Instead, she had grown weak and listless. Her school uniform hung loose on her frame. She no longer had energy to play or even to complain about being hungry. She simply existed in a state of quiet exhaustion. The government had told them that Americans were starving too, that the entire world was suffering, that their enemies had even less than they did. It had been easier to endure the hunger, believing that everyone shared in the sacrifice equally. But now Tomoko knew the truth. She had seen the American kitchen, had watched them prepare meals with an abundance that seemed impossible. She had eaten ham and beans and bread with butter. She had seen guards casually leave food on their plates because they were full, something no Japanese person had done in years. The propaganda had been a lie. Americans were not starving. They had never been starving. While Japanese mothers had watched their children waste away, while families had divided single bowls of watery soup among 5 people, Americans had been eating until they were satisfied and then eating dessert. The realization filled Tomoko with a confusion so profound it felt like physical pain. She had been willing to die for her country. She had believed in the righteousness of their cause, in the necessity of their sacrifice. But her country had lied to her about something so fundamental, so basic, as whether their enemies had food. If they had lied about that, what else had been a lie? Beside her, Midori whispered in the darkness, "Tomoko, are you awake?" "Yes." "I cannot stop thinking about my mother, about how hungry she must be." Tomoko had no answer. She only knew that something inside her had broken today, and she was not sure it could ever be repaired. October brought cooler weather to California, and with it came an unexpected invitation. Sergeant Mary Patterson, the head of the camp kitchen, requested volunteers among the Japanese women to assist with meal preparation. The request had been carefully worded through a translator, emphasizing that participation was entirely voluntary and would not affect their treatment as prisoners. Tomoko volunteered immediately, driven by curiosity more than any desire to be helpful. She wanted to understand the source of this impossible abundance. She needed to see with her own eyes where all this food came from and why Americans seemed to have so much of it. On her first morning in the kitchen, Tomoko stood in stunned silence. Sacks of flour and sugar sat stacked against the walls, each one larger than anything she had ever seen in Japanese military supplies. Crates of fresh vegetables arrived daily from local farms. There was meat in quantities she had thought impossible. But what struck her most was how casually the American staff treated all of it, as if such abundance was simply normal and expected. Sergeant Patterson was a sturdy woman in her 40s, with flour permanently dusted on her apron and laugh lines around her eyes. She communicated through gestures and simple words, patient when the Japanese women did not understand, encouraging when they succeeded at new tasks. Midori had also volunteered, along with Ayako and 3 other women. They worked quietly at first, uncertain and watchful, but Sergeant Patterson's genuine warmth was difficult to resist. When Midori accidentally dropped a spoon, she expected punishment. Instead, Sergeant Patterson simply picked it up, smiled, and handed her a clean one. It was during the preparation of an apple pie that something shifted. Sergeant Patterson was teaching them to peel and slice apples, demonstrating the proper technique. She handed Midori a slice of raw apple to taste, gesturing for her to eat it. Midori bit into it hesitantly, and her eyes widened at the crisp sweetness. Before she could stop herself, she smiled. Sergeant Patterson smiled back and offered apple slices to all the women. For several minutes, they simply stood together in the kitchen, eating fresh apples as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Japanese prisoners and American staff sharing food without ceremony or significance, just human beings enjoying something sweet together. Tomoko felt tears prick her eyes unexpectedly. This casual kindness, this simple sharing of food, was breaking down something inside her that she had not known was there. In Japan, every bite of food had been precious, fought for, rationed with military precision. Here, a sergeant gave away apple slices just to see prisoners smile. That afternoon, they baked 6 apple pies together, the kitchen filled with the scent of cinnamon and butter and caramelized sugar. When Sergeant Patterson cut into the first pie to check if it was done, she offered Tomoko a taste. The warm sweetness melted on her tongue, and Tomoko understood something profound. Food could be more than sustenance. It could be an act of generosity, a bridge between enemies, a language that required no translation. November brought the first opportunity for the women to contact their families through the International Red Cross. Camp administrators set up a writing station in the recreation hall, providing paper, pens, and translators to help compose letters that might reach Japan. The women lined up eagerly, desperate for any connection to the families they had left behind. Tomoko sat at the wooden table with blank paper before her, her pen hovering uncertainly. What could she possibly say? That she was well-fed and treated kindly by her captors? That she ate more in American captivity than she had eaten in the final year of the war? Such words would sound like betrayal or delusion. Instead, she wrote simply. She told her parents she was alive and unharmed. She asked about Yuki, about whether they had enough to eat, about whether their house had survived the bombing raids she had heard about. She asked them to write back quickly, because she did not know how long she would remain at this camp or where she might be sent next. She addressed the letter to her family home in Tokyo and handed it to the Red Cross representative with hands that trembled slightly. All 37 women wrote letters that day. They wrote to parents, siblings, husbands, children. They wrote with hope and fear competing in their hearts. The letters were collected, processed, and sent across the Pacific to a Japan that was now occupied by American forces, a defeated nation struggling to survive. 6 weeks passed before the first responses arrived. Only 4 letters came back, and none of them were for Tomoko. Noriko received word that her parents were alive, but that their home had been destroyed in the firebombing of Tokyo. They were living in a refugee shelter with dozens of other displaced families. Her younger brother had died of illness related to malnutrition 2 months before Japan's surrender. Noriko read her letter in silence, tears streaming down her face. The other women gathered around her, offering what comfort they could, but there was nothing to say that could ease such grief. The following week brought more letters, but also more devastating news. Ayako learned that her entire family had perished when Hiroshima was destroyed. The letter came from a distant cousin who had been away from the city on the day of the atomic bombing. He informed her that she was now the last surviving member of her immediate family. For most of the women, including Tomoko, no letters came at all. The addresses they had written to no longer existed, or the people they had written to could not be found, or perhaps the letters simply could not reach them through the chaos of occupation and reconstruction. The silence was its own form of torture, not knowing whether their families were alive or dead, whether anyone was waiting for their return. Tomoko stood at the barracks window that evening, looking out at the California landscape that was nothing like home. She thought about her mother and father and Yuki, wondering if they were hungry tonight, wondering if they were even alive to be hungry. November 22nd, 1945. The American holiday called Thanksgiving was approaching, and the camp buzzed with unusual activity. Sergeant Patterson invited all the Japanese women to participate in preparing the feast, explaining through translators that this was a tradition of gratitude and abundance meant to be shared with everyone, even prisoners. Tomoko had learned enough English by now to understand some of what Sergeant Patterson said. The concept seemed strange to her. A holiday dedicated entirely to eating and expressing thanks? In Japan, such excess would have been considered wasteful and inappropriate, especially during wartime. Yet here were Americans planning an enormous meal to celebrate thankfulness while their country was still technically at war with Japan in occupied territories. The preparations began days in advance. Tomoko and Midori helped peel mountains of potatoes, their hands aching by the end of each session. Ayako, despite her grief over her family's death, threw herself into making what Sergeant Patterson called stuffing, a bread-based dish seasoned with herbs Ayako had never encountered before. Noriko learned to make cranberry sauce, marveling at the tartness of the berries and the amount of sugar added to balance the flavor. But it was the turkeys that shocked them most. Enormous birds, each one large enough to feed an entire Japanese family for a week, arrived in quantities that seemed obscene. Sergeant Patterson showed them how to prepare the birds, and the women worked in silence, overwhelmed by such extravagance. On Thanksgiving morning, Tomoko woke to the smell of roasting meat filling the entire camp. By midday, the mess hall had been transformed. Long tables were covered with white cloths, and decorations made from autumn leaves and paper crafts adorned the walls. The Japanese women had been invited to eat with the American staff rather than separately, an arrangement that made many of them uncomfortable. When the food was finally served, Tomoko sat between Midori and Private Daniel Cooper, who had specifically chosen to sit with the Japanese women. Her plate was piled impossibly high with sliced turkey, mashed potatoes swimming in gravy, sweet potatoes topped with melted marshmallows, green beans, stuffing, cranberry sauce, and fresh bread rolls with butter. A separate plate held 2 different kinds of pie for dessert. She stared at the food, feeling something break inside her chest. This single meal contained more food than her entire family had eaten in a month during the war. While her sister had grown weak from hunger, while her father had sacrificed his portions to keep his daughters alive, Americans had been planning feasts like this. Sergeant Patterson stood and raised her glass. Speaking in English, the translator conveyed her words. "Today we give thanks for peace, for plenty, and for the opportunity to share our blessings with others." Tomoko picked up her fork with trembling hands. Around her, other Japanese women were crying quietly as they ate. This was not just food. This was evidence of everything they had been lied to about, everything they had misunderstood about their enemy, everything that had cost them so much. December brought news that repatriation procedures were being finalized. The Japanese women would be returned to their homeland within 2 months, processed through displaced persons facilities in Tokyo before being released to find whatever remained of their former lives. The announcement should have brought relief and joy. Instead, it brought only quiet dread. Tomoko sat on her bunk that evening, holding the pen Sergeant Patterson had given her. Her diary lay open before her, but the words would not come easily. What did she want to say about the choice that was forming in her mind? What could she write that would make sense of the confusion tearing her apart? Finally, she began to write in Japanese, the characters flowing across the page with familiar comfort, even as the thoughts behind them were anything but comfortable. I do not know who I am anymore. I came here believing I was Japanese, that my identity was fixed and certain. But what does it mean to be Japanese now? To return to a country that lied to us? To go back to hunger after knowing abundance? To pretend that what we learned here did not matter? Around her, other women were having similar conversations in hushed voices. Midori spoke of her fear of returning to Tokyo, to the refugee shelter where her parents struggled to survive. "What will I contribute?" she asked Tomoko. "I will be just another mouth to feed in a country that has no food. Here, I am learning nursing skills from Dr. Patterson. There, I will have nothing." Ayako's situation was even more stark. With her entire family dead in Hiroshima, she had no home to return to, no one waiting for her arrival. "I will be alone in Japan," she said quietly. "At least here, I have friends. I have work. I have purpose." Noriko, at 19, the youngest among them, expressed what many were thinking but feared to say aloud. "Is it shameful to admit that I do not want to go back, that I am happier here as a prisoner than I was there as a free person?" The question hung in the air, dangerous and honest. To admit such feelings seemed like the ultimate betrayal of their country, their culture, their families. Yet the truth was undeniable. In American captivity, they had found something that Japan had never given them: enough food, kind treatment, respect for their dignity, and the opportunity to develop skills and friendships without constant fear and deprivation. Private Daniel Cooper had begun teaching basic English classes in the evenings, and more than half the Japanese women attended regularly. They learned not just words but concepts that did not exist in their previous understanding of America. Words like opportunity and choice and second chance. Tomoko closed her diary and looked around the barracks at the women who had become her family over these months. They were all wrestling with the same impossible question. Was home a place you came from, or was it a place where you could finally become who you were meant to be? January 15, 1946. The day had arrived. Camp Commander Colonel James Morrison called a General Assembly to announce the final repatriation schedule. The 37 Japanese women gathered in the mess hall, their faces reflecting months of internal struggle about this inevitable moment. Colonel Morrison stood before them, his translator beside him. "Ladies, transport has been arranged to return you to Japan. You will depart in 2 weeks on February 1st. You will be processed through Tokyo and released to return to your families and homes." The words should have brought joy. Instead, a heavy silence filled the room. Then Tomoko stood up slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say in English for weeks, practicing with Daniel until her pronunciation was clear. "Colonel Morrison, may I speak?" The colonel looked surprised but nodded. Permission granted. Tomoko's voice shook, but her words were clear. "Some of us wish to request something unusual. We wish to ask if we might stay in America rather than return to Japan immediately." A murmur ran through both the Japanese women and the American staff. This was unprecedented. Prisoners of war requesting to remain with their captors? It seemed impossible, perhaps even insulting to both nations. Midori stood next, then Ayako, then Noriko. 8 more women rose to their feet, forming a small group within the larger assembly. 11 women total, making a choice that would define the rest of their lives. Colonel Morrison's face showed his shock. "I need to understand this clearly. You are requesting to remain in the United States rather than accept repatriation to your home country." Tomoko spoke again, her English carefully chosen. "Japan is not our home anymore." "Sir, the Japan we served does not exist. Our families are dead or scattered. We have no homes to return to. Here we have found work, kindness, and purpose. We wish to stay if America will allow it." The other women who had stood began speaking, some in broken English, others through the translator. They spoke of lost families, destroyed homes, and the fear of returning to a country where they would be seen as failures for having been captured. But more than that, they spoke of what they had discovered in American captivity: dignity, opportunity, and the chance to build new lives rather than return to the ruins of old ones. The remaining 26 women chose repatriation, and their choice was equally valid. They wanted to help rebuild Japan, to find surviving family members, to contribute to their country's recovery. They would carry with them the lessons they had learned about American kindness, serving as bridges between former enemies. Colonel Morrison promised to forward their unprecedented request to Washington. The decision would take weeks to arrive, but in that moment, standing divided by their choices yet united by their shared experience, the women understood that whatever happened next, they had already been forever changed by ham and navy beans and the Americans who had served them with unexpected grace. 1965, San Francisco's Japantown. Tomoko Hayashi Cooper stood in the kitchen of her small restaurant, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she prepared the evening's special: ham and navy beans served alongside perfectly seasoned Japanese rice and pickled vegetables. The restaurant, called Bridge, had become a beloved fixture in the neighborhood, known for its unique blend of American and Japanese cuisine that somehow made perfect sense on the same plate. Through the kitchen window, she could see her dining room filling with the dinner crowd. At the corner table sat her husband, Daniel Cooper, now 44 years old and still wearing his easy cowboy smile. Across from him sat Sergeant Mary Patterson, retired now, but still with flowers somehow dusted on her collar. Their children, 14-year-old Sarah and 12-year-old James, were doing homework at a nearby table, completely unaware that their very existence represented a bridge between nations that had once tried to destroy each other. Midori worked beside Tomoko in the kitchen. She had completed her nursing degree and worked at San Francisco General Hospital, but she helped at the restaurant on weekends because cooking together reminded them of where they had started. "The navy beans are ready," she said in English, though they still spoke Japanese together when alone. Ayako entered through the back door, arriving from her job as a social worker helping Japanese immigrants navigate American systems. She had never married, dedicating her life instead to serving others as a way of honoring the family she had lost. "Am I too late for dinner?" she asked, smiling. "You are right on time," Tomoko replied. Noriko was the only one of their group who had returned to Japan, choosing in 1958 to help establish exchange programs between American and Japanese universities. She visited San Francisco twice a year, and her letters spoke of a Japan that had risen from devastation to become a peaceful, prosperous nation. She always wrote that their choice to stay had been as important as her choice to return, that both paths had served the cause of reconciliation. As Tomoko carried plates out to the dining room, she paused to look at a framed photograph on the wall. 37 Japanese women standing in front of a California barracks in 1945, their faces uncertain, but their eyes holding the first glimmers of hope. Beside it hung another photo from 1964. The same women, scattered across two countries, but reunited for a commemoration ceremony, their faces now confident and peaceful. Daniel caught her eye from his table and smiled. It was the same smile he had given her 20 years ago when he had offered her strawberry preserves, not knowing that simple gesture would begin her transformation from enemy to friend to wife to American citizen. She smiled back and set down plates of ham and navy beans before her customers. The food that had once represented everything she had been lied to about had become her language of love, her way of building bridges, her daily reminder that redemption was possible when people chose kindness over hatred.